function as an organization. And the board members who are here, thank you again for your governance of Yes Prep. You help us continue to fulfill our mission. So thank you to all of you for joining. Quick updates. As you know, as you might know, we started our elementary growth in August of 2020, started the planning for it in 2018, having no idea that we would actually be opening our first 2 elementary schools smack dab in the middle of the pandemic, but successfully opened those 2, opened 2 more this past August, and we are on track to open elementary schools 5 and 6 at Airline and East End. And then we have the 2 properties under contract for elementary schools 7 and 8 that will open the following August. So we have a clear path to 8 of the 10 elementary schools that are scheduled to open in this strategic plan, which is known as Leading Houston Forward. Quick update on the Leading Houston Forward plan. It was an audacious goal that we set in 2019 to raise $80 million. In large part, thanks to our advancement team and many of you on this call. We are now at 68 million, on our way to 80, and trying to close that out by December of 2022, full year and a half ahead of schedule. So we will continue to provide relevant updates there, but again, we would not be even close to that without a number of people on this call and without the hard work of our advancement team. Final thing I wanted to give you an update on before I pass to our panel discussion is the class of 2022. We are in full planning for graduations and senior signing day, and I'll have more information about senior signing day at the end. But for now, just wanted to let you know that we have 1,621 seniors that are preparing to graduate. It'll be our largest senior class ever. 90% of them have been accepted to 4-year colleges or universities. That's still a graduation requirement at Yes Prep. In order to, and we do offer exceptions to that rule, but in order to be exempt from that graduation requirement, it actually requires a board action. So we bring some of our special needs students, special cases to the board at a meeting in the beginning of May, where they'll vote on the exceptions, but it is very much an exception to the rule. The goal is to get this as close to 100% of our students accepted into a college or university. Whether or not they choose to matriculate is a decision they make in consultation with their counselors and with their families. But we're excited that we have in our intent to enroll survey, 80% of our seniors intending to enroll, which is a strong leading indicator of future matriculation, which is up from about 60% this time last year. So massive growth. We're seeing our students rebound in terms of their desire to go to college. This was a national crisis, if you followed it, in terms of college matriculation, especially hitting hard for students from underserved and low-income communities. So we're proud to see that number back up to 80%. And again, our goal is to get that as close to 100% as possible, knowing though that college is not the right answer for every single student at Yes Prep, but we still firmly believe that college readiness is the default path for every student at Yes Prep. And then a couple scholarship wins, if you didn't get a chance to see it. I believe we sent this out, but if not, we can send it out afterwards. Videos of 2 Gulfton students receiving $100,000 scholarships from a local business. Just if you haven't seen the video, we'll send it out. And fair warning, you must have a box of tissues ready when you're watching these. It's just unbelievable testimony to the support of the community and the work of these students. And then 10 of our students were selected as QuestBridge Scholars, national scholarship. The idea here being that we don't just try and get our kids into college, but also make sure that they have the resources necessary to persist in college and ultimately graduate. So that's what we're doing at Yes Prep, kind of on the large scale. But what we want to do is now really dive into some of the more specific work that's going on both at Yes Prep and in our community. And so I'm going to pass to Naeem. Did I say your name correctly, Naeem? Yes, okay.
Indeed.
I'm going to pass to Naeem to lead our panel discussion. Thank you again for being here. Off to you, Naeem, sorry.
Thank you, Mark. And I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for everybody for including me into this space. It's never a dull time to talk about student health and wellness. I am a student support counselor in middle school, and I come from the Washington, D.C. area where I did the same thing at a high school level. And so knowing that the advisory council is having a space for this conversation and I'm included, I'm very, very excited for this imperative and pertinent conversation. I'm also going to introduce our co-panelists for this conversation. we have Dr. Andrea Link, who's the Executive Director for the Albert Schweitzer Fellowship of the Houston-Galveston area. She's also a Yes Prep board member. Dr. Link, welcome to the space. Please feel free to introduce yourself and, if you don't mind, telling us a little bit about your work with children in schools.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So I started out my career as a pediatrician, and I was with Texas Children's for a number of years. And then I kind of took a sharp left turn and had a change in my clinical interests, and started working with women exiting the criminal justice system, and began a program for them called Healthy and Whole under the auspices of Healthcare for the Homeless Houston. And that was a program that really focused on addressing and evaluating trauma in that population. More recently, as Naeem has indicated, I've been serving as the executive director of the Schweitzer Fellowship. We are a service learning and leadership development program for undergraduates and graduate students, with a particular focus on fellows who are individuals of color and who come from low-income families. And as he also mentioned, I'm truly honored to be on the Yes Prep board. In terms of my work with children and schools now, I mostly focus on our fellows, who are adolescents from about 18 to the early to mid 20s, but I still teach medical students and I interact with a lot of the pediatricians on the front line. And during the pandemic, I planned and opened a pediatric clinic and a supportive housing program here in Houston. So while I don't practice medicine anymore clinically, I still have my hand and very much my heart in the pediatric world.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Link, for joining us. Also want to introduce our other co-panelist, nurse practitioner Jessica Jin. She joins us from Legacy Community Health, and she's the Senior Director of School-Based Health. Jessica, please tell us a little bit about yourself and about your work with children in schools.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. So as Naeem said, I am the Senior Director of Legacy School-Based Health Program, which means that I am in charge of all 32 of our legacy, the medical side of all of our Legacy School-Based Health clinics, including the 17 at Yes Prep. I'm also a pediatric nurse practitioner, and I've been with Legacy for 6 years in the school-based health department. Previous to this role, I served as the nurse practitioner at the Yes Prep East End campus for the last 5 years. And I currently see patients at Yes Prep Gulfton twice a month. So Yes Prep has a special place in my heart, especially those East End kids.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. As we transition into our conversation, I just wanted to inform everybody there will be time for a Q&A at the end, but also if you feel enthusiastic to ask a question, please use the raise the hand feature, and we'll be happy to moderate the hands that go up and field the questions as they may come. One of the things that and Mark mentioned earlier, one of the things to think about is how the past 2 years have been difficult for many of our students in several different ways. Wanted to have some conversation about some of those issues, whether they be physical or mental, and what you've seen students facing. Dr. Link, I'll turn it over to you first for a brief response on that.
Sure. So I can kind of take the macro view here and remind everybody, as you may have heard a couple of months ago, that the American Academy of Pediatrics and some other children's health advocacy groups actually declared a national emergency in child and adolescent mental health. But really, this is just an acceleration of the trends that we've been seeing in the last decade. So between 2010 and 2020, we've had a really steady rise in anxiety, depression, suicidality, drug use. But then the addition of COVID and the isolation and the economic stress that it caused for many, especially low-income families, we now really do have soaring rates of loneliness, anxiety, depression, et cetera. And I think that that's so important that we address it now, because we know that childhood trauma can affect an individual's well-being far out of childhood, like into their 70s and 80s. And we know this from the landmark ACE study. So ACEs are adverse childhood events. And it was a study done in 1998 that was really so shocking that people thought it was a mistake. And it turns out more than 700 studies have not only confirmed, but expanded what ACEs, what they're about. So what the reason, and I'll be very brief on this, but I think it really is important. The researchers administered just a 10-question survey to adults to find out whether they had had certain neglect, trauma, or household challenges in their lives. And what they found was that it was incredibly correlated with later adult medical and health outcomes. So if you had a score of, say, 2, you had double the chance of having substance abuse. If you had a 4, you had 200 to 400 times the risk of things like hepatitis, heart disease, cancer. And if you had a 7 or a 6, you had 20 years taken off your life. So we now know this, and better than that, we know what it takes to fix it. So, I mean, I think we can really this can be depressing, but it can also be really hopeful and helpful, because the reality is that this is not one of those diseases that we think, oh gosh, this is terrible. We need so much more research to figure out how to treat it. We know what to do. We just need the will and the funding to actually make it happen.
Well said, Dr. Lincoln. Thank you for that response. And you mentioned something that struck home with me, being a middle school social worker and being here day in and day out and seeing the unique challenges that students are faced with. And I saw a recent study by the US Department of Health and Human Services that had said, the decade before the pandemic, suicide ideation and attempts had increased 36%. Mm-hmm. And if we were in the state of emergency before, we certainly are in one now in terms of what we're dealing with, in terms of what we're seeing in mental health. And, it's one of my roles is, and I'll share with I'll let our nurse practitioners comment in on a moment. One of my roles is to meet some of those challenges firsthand and to find outlets and resources and partnerships that we have to kind of aid some of those things we're seeing with this crisis. With that said, Jessica, I'll turn it over to you. What are you seeing in terms of mental health issues, or physical as well, that students are facing?
Yeah, and I kind of have the boots on the ground approach because we've definitely seen an increase in obesity since the kids have returned to campus. In the last 2 years, we told kids to stay at home. We canceled sports. They didn't have recess. We know some kids don't have a safe place to exercise at home. We knew that parents lost their job and they can't afford the healthy, nice, food. So we've definitely seen an increase in obesity. Which has led to an increase in things like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and high cholesterol. We've also seen a big increase in the depression and anxiety, like Dr. Link was saying. Kids are experiencing social isolation. Many of them, even though their parents do have a new job, that not having a job for a while put a financial strain on them. The cyberbullying has been a big issue. Cyberbullying definitely has affected a lot of kids this year. And then also they're using drugs as a coping mechanism. A lot of them have drugs that we didn't used to have, like vaping and things like that. And also the increase in the fentanyl being laced in things that they didn't know it could be in. So we've definitely seen an increase in anxiety and depression.
Yeah, certainly some of the very real challenges that we're seeing day in and day out in 2022. Absolutely. We know that Yes Prep, as it is, does a lot to support our schools, our students, and the school community. In the 2021 school year alone, there were across the 21 campuses, there were 84 master's level counselors there to support our school community. I remember when I was moving from the Washington, D.C. area and then made Houston my new home and trying to find a new role and how I'm going to work as a social worker and continue my passion for working in schools. There weren't many options, and this was a little over 4 years ago, but I was happy to see that Yes Prep was one of those options. Yes Prep was one of those places to work that took mental health serious enough to have roles like student support counselors for me to apply to be a part of. And when I think about the role that mental health practitioners and professionals play in the future, it's going to be imperative that there are counselors and social workers and people with at least master's level degrees in institutions of learning across the board. We know that also, Yes Prep has partnerships with Legacy and Texas Child Health Access, TCHAT. I can't speak enough about the partnership with TCHAT, which is like a virtual ambulance in times of need that we can match some of our students and families with when they're faced with crisis. So we know Yes Prep is in my opinion, and I'm sure it would be shared across many in this conversation, is leading the path here in Texas about what we can do to support our students during this trying time. But we also want to think about what can we add, right? What can we add to the plethora of things that we're already doing? How can we best help students today in 2022 faced with these new challenges? What more can we be doing to ensure that they're set up for success? Jessica, I'll turn it over to you. Thoughts and opinions on that?
Yeah, so I think one of the main things that we really noticed at Legacy that didn't happen and we think is really important is making sure that every child gets an annual well child exam. The annual well child exam includes a mental health screening, food insecurity screening, because we noticed that a lot of times the school isn't even aware that these kids don't have food at home. It includes a full physical exam, blood work, and vaccines if necessary, and also health education. The health education is really important, especially for the teenagers, because this is the first time anyone's ever talked to them about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They're not having that at home. I've also heard from counselors in the past that they're really good at identifying the kids that are acting out because of mental health issues, but they rely on the clinics to help identify those kids that are withdrawing and not joining activities because of their mental health issues. And then once we find those kids, we need to do something about it. So, making sure that we have access to the mental health professionals, making sure that we have access to speakers that can talk about drug use and the negative effects of them.
Certainly access. In 2022, access is the more technology has advanced, right? We still want to make sure that nobody's slipping through the cracks and everybody's providing equal opportunity to access, which is so very important. Dr. Link, I'll turn it over to you for your thoughts and comments on what more we can be doing to help ensure students are set up for success and how we can best help students today.
Yeah, and first let me say, to join the chorus here, that the more I learn about Yes Prep, the more impressed I am in terms of how many layers of support that you all have to support these students. As from a pediatrician's perspective, you really, I've just been incredibly impressed. In terms of, what can we do? I mean, I think I always start with first principles, right? Put on your oxygen mask first. If you are in any way a person who advocates for children, who deals with children as a parent or as an educator or as a physician or nurse practitioner, every person who's in a position to interact with kids needs to check in that they're doing okay. So have you gone and gotten those preventative health measures that you may have put off for the 2 years that we have been living in this pandemic? This is the time. Get that mammogram done, get the colonoscopy done, but prioritize your health and make sure that you're doing okay. And then get back to all of those good preventative health things that your own personal doctor tells you about. Eating right, exercising, taking breaks from social media, practicing your own mindfulness and centering techniques. And then, experiences like this, talks like this, where we all need to become aware of the stresses that are faced by our most marginalized students and how the pandemic has worsened their mental health and increased the ACEs that they have. But I think the most important thing to think about ACEs is it's a mutable factor. So your ACE is not your destiny, not by any stretch of the imagination. And we know there's a whole plethora of interventions that can be done on the family, medical, and school level that can really change the trajectory of these kids who have a higher ACE score. And one of the things is so simple, which is that we now know there's a growing body of evidence that a real branch point for children who have had this toxic stress. Let me just back up for 1 second and explain what I mean by toxic stress. So the best way I've ever heard this described is regular stress is like if you run into a bear in the woods and it gives you that extra performance and you're able to run away from that bear, you're in great shape, right? Toxic stress is when that bear comes home to live with you. And it's like revving your car's engine all the time. It's not good for the engine. It's not good for the body. But we know that there are things that can be done to mitigate that toxic stress. And one of the things is so simple, and I think it's one of the things that Yes Prep does so beautifully, which is that the critical factor is, was there a one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult? You really one, of course, we all like to have more than one, but just having that one makes a huge difference. And the most critical component of that relationship is really this serve and response. And you may have heard of this term before, but it's very much a part of kind of this trauma-informed and trauma-aware way of thinking of things, which is kids develop self-confidence and feeling that the world is safe if then when they do A, B happens. So if you think about many probably parents on this call, when your baby cried, you went and checked on them, and did they have a dirty diaper? Were they hungry? Were they sleepy? But you intervened and did something, and then they felt better, and you got more bonded to them, and it starts this virtuous cycle, right? And it's called a rally. So the more rallies in a child's life, the more resilient they can be, and the more they can focus on their own self, because their environment, at least part of it, is safe and predictable. So these are just really and these are not high cost interventions, right? But there are interventions that do cost money. And I think another thing we can do is really, and I know we're going to be talking about this later, but really advocate for policy change that leads to more robust mental health services, more health services available on campuses, like what Legacy does, like what you all have with the connection, the telemedicine connection with UT Health, and more staff to address issues that may not rise up to the level of a psychiatrist.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Lincoln. We'll certainly will be getting to some of the public policy and where we are in 2022 in terms of advancing student health and wellness. One of the things that we want to think about and maybe make a distinction of is some of the experiences of the wide age range of students in the population that we serve, right? As early as elementary school to secondary students. Want to invite some conversation about some of the challenges facing elementary students and secondary students and how they might differ. Jessica, I'll turn it over to you for comment.
Yeah, thank you. So this is the first year that we've had full-time nurse practitioners in 2 of the elementary schools. And we've learned that we're running into some challenges that we weren't really seeing in the high schools. So a lot of times for some of these kids, it's the first time they've ever been in any type of school setting. And we're seeing a lot of like undiagnosed ADHD, learning disorders, anxiety, speech disorders, a couple kids like undiagnosed autism, things that parents haven't ever been able to, compare their kids to other kids or see how well they're functioning compared to other kids their age. We've also learned that a lot of parents and students had never had anyone talk to them ever about any type of healthy foods and getting exercise in, which is really important at the elementary school level to prevent problems later on. With the high schoolers, it's usually a kind of a different problems. One of the ones that we've been seeing, some of the things that we've been seeing like lately an increase in, like we said, anxiety, depression, the cyberbullying that has happened in the last 2 years, the increase in drug use. There's definitely been more reports of drug use. And then also, unfortunately, teenage pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections have increased in the last 2 years. I think one of those contributing factors is that missing health education part that they weren't getting the last 2 years. And then also not having access to the healthcare, our space is a safe space for them to come into. And when they were at home, they didn't have that access. So those are kind of the differences that we've seen in the elementary and high school students at Yes Prep.
Yes, thank you for sharing. Dr. Lincoln, I'll invite you in for comment as well.
Yeah, well, Jessica did such a good job in describing the challenges. I think the only thing I can really add is talking just a little bit about how these various age groups manifest that stress. Elementary age students tend to have a lot of somatization. So they'll have stomach aches or headaches. They also can be irritable or angry, worsening school performance, withdrawal from family and friends. And then as Jessica mentioned, in teens, certainly anxiety and depression, but then also poor coping skills like going to substance use for relief of their stress.
Yes, and as a school social worker in middle school, I'll have to give a special shout out to a certain place in my heart for all the middle school warriors across the Yes Prep board that work with adolescents at that age. Definitely one of the things you mentioned is coping skills and sometimes lack of communication skills that many of our students at that age don't already have. And so it's social workers like myself that maybe do small groups that give them the opportunity to learn what a coping skill is, to learn what stress is and how to communicate different levels of emotions, which is certainly something that's very important and a very valued lesson that our students get to learn via me and other student support counselors working in the middle school level. Also highlighting at the high school level, some of the uptick in risky behavior. We've seen since the pandemic, some of the uptick in substance abuse, which it's no secret that substance abuse has been around since before the pandemic, but certainly in times after the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in that. And I think part of the things we talk about is psychoeducation, informing our school community about the dangers of substance abuse, and partnering with other Houston area organizations such as Legacy, also Houston Crime Stoppers coming to different campuses like ours and educating families firsthand about the dangers and risks of these things and some of the fine nuances and some of the new drugs that are out there on the market. I think Jessica, I'll echo what she said earlier, this is a new day and age when we're talking about drugs and drug use, and hearing firsthand from Crime Stoppers about what they are, the dangers are, and the science behind it is very, very helpful. So making spaces to have those conversations and inviting and partnering with organizations is very important. We did have some slight mention about where we are in the legislative conversation about mental health and access thereof. We know that student mental health is an emerging public policy priority. There were a number of interim charges set forth by the speaker related to this issue, so we should see legislative action hopefully in the spring. From what you know of the issue, what would you think would be the most impactful policy change Texas could make? Dr. Link, I'll start with you this time.
Well, I mean, honestly, I was pretty shocked to read that we don't have any mandated numbers of social workers or counselors to children. And, this idea that mental health care should be the sole responsibility of parents, I mean, to me is nonsensical. The truth is that schools have kids all day long and are better connected and better able to I sometimes identify kids who are struggling than parents who they themselves may be really struggling and not sure. And, we talked about this Houston Chronicle article about just how few counselors there are in the public school system, as opposed to what Yes Prep has, which is really dramatically different. And there's a story of this mom who keeps trying to get help for her teenage daughter who is really struggling and needs help. And she turns to, resource after resource and can't find the help that she needs. And so I think that schools do have a role to play in supporting all kids, but also identifying those kids who need more resources. And hopefully, ideally, providing it on campus or close to campus. And I think, the truth is that takes funds, and we are not going to solve this problem without the application of some funds. But it's penny wise and pound foolish. Even if you are like cold-hearted and you're looking at this as an economic problem, because if you let this trauma and this toxic stress go unaddressed in children, this is going to cost the taxpayer an inordinate amount more when they are 65 years old, diabetic with COPD and an alcoholic.
Yeah, very well said. And one of the things you hinted on was just resources, right? And access to resources and where things are being allocated. In preparing for this conversation, I reviewed the National Association of Mental Illness Texas chapter. They have a one-page public policy platform in which they are advocating for everybody to kind of get on board behind some of the things that they feel pertinent moving into the next legislation, 88th legislation And one of those things was having a mental health task force just to make sure that there's equitable access in institutions of higher education all across the board, and comprehensive mental health services as well. One of the things that they're championing is just enhanced funding, right, for mental health facilities that are caring to uninsured and underinsured individuals and families, because sometimes there's major barriers there in terms of how they get access to mental health. Jessica, I'll turn it over to you as well for comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I would say would be a grant program for school-based health behavioral health centers. In 2019, Legacy presented it, but it didn't pass. We are planning on presenting it again. We know that there's a need for funding for mental health professionals. We know that they need to be at schools. This grant would allow to would pay for the salary to cover the mental health professionals, and also allow schools to partner with health entities like Legacy to make school-based clinics on campus or near campus. And I do think that that would be really a great thing if we could get some type of grant funding for that, to make this school-based clinics.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, again, moving here from a different city to the Houston area, as a social worker, you know, we're looking for who has the competitive salary, how can we make a great living doing the jobs that we love. Not to shoot my own self in the foot, but I'm happy to say that yes, Prep is up there with offering a competitive salary for positions like myself to do what I do and to keep me happy, right? To make me comfortable and having enough financial resources to continue to push on and do what I do day in and day out. There's some additional things that maybe we could use. I know at one point each social worker had like a cell phone that they would have, and the use of that cell phone has kind of gone away with our the merge of the new technology we have with phones on our computer spaces. But I'll say as a social worker, there's nothing like having a business cell phone, because we're so on our feet. Very rarely are we always at the desk in front of the computer. So getting access back to those cell phones would be a huge win for us to be able to communicate with our families as we're moving around the school building, moving around the school community. This is a very heavy subject, I'm sure, and there's several different ways we can continue this conversation, but there will be time for Q&A, but also wanted to highlight some of the most rewarding parts of this job, right? Some of the most rewarding things that we do day in and day out, working to increase student health and wellness. Wanted to give our panelists a chance to just kind of discuss the most rewarding part of their job and what they're most hopeful for in the future. Jessica, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's an easy one. The most rewarding part of my job is watching these kids succeed despite the barriers that they have. Senior signing day, that feeling when you feel like you might have just made like a little tiny difference in their life to help them get to where they are. It's an amazing feeling. And, you know, I get up and go to work every day and I actually feel like I'm doing something good and helping others. So, you know, definitely easy question. But I do think I'm really hopeful for the future. I think now that they have we have said it's a health crisis, like we are having a national health crisis with adolescents' mental health, that we'll be able to, you know, continue to break down barriers to healthcare and continue to decrease the stigma of mental health.
Absolutely. Dr. Link, I'll invite you to comment as well.
Yeah, this is easy for me too. So, you know, the most fun part of being the director of the fellowship is the fellows. So we have 72 coming in this year. And as I mentioned, 80% are individuals of color, and many are either first generation or children of refugees or immigrants. And seeing these young people who are resilient, they have whatever intervention they needed, they received, because here they are thriving in, you know, these top universities that we have in Houston, in pharmacy school or medical school, nursing school, social work school. And their passion and energy for giving back absolutely motivates me every day. You know, sometimes it's hard to, you know, you hear the news and, you know, just there's so many difficult things going on. And then I meet with a fellow and, you know, one of my favorites said a long time ago, all I do is think about how to make my project better. And I think, okay, well, with kids like that in our future, I think we're going to be okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Lincoln. I'll have to echo those sentiments. The most rewarding part of my job as a school social workers, especially at the middle school level, is meeting students where they are with their challenges and placing some interventions to help and support them so that by the time they are juniors or seniors, seeing them thrive. And then knowing that when they leave the school community, it will still be a community that they call home, and look forward to coming back with the same passion to help others, right? Find their interventions and find the things that they need at the very young age and a young stage, so that by the time they're juniors and seniors and beyond, that they're well equipped to come back to Yes Prep and continue to push the envelope forward. So wanted to thank you, Dr. Link and Jessica, for those comments and responses to those questions. Certainly, like we said, a conversation that can go on for a long period of time, but wanted to open up the floor now for any questions that might be out there. Please feel free to unmute yourself or just raise your hand and let's field some thoughts.
Dr.
Okay,
Link?
Miss.
Sorry, I jumped the gun there. You mentioned this ACEs, the score, the 1 to 10, and the serious consequences of even probably a 1 or a 2, but that we know how to mitigate those adverse events. Can you just give me kind of an example of something, the adverse event, and then the intervention that that would be brought in to mitigate that?
Absolutely. So they're divided into, there are about 3 questions on abuse, and that is not just sexual or physical, it can be emotional abuse. There's 3 questions on neglect. Do you feel sometimes you didn't have enough food? Did you feel like nobody really cared about you? And then the remaining 4 questions are on household challenges, things like, do you have a family member who was in prison? Do you have you ever witnessed intimate partner violence in your family? So they're fairly heavy questions in terms of, these are big deals, these 10, but they tend to go together, right? And we know that even starting at 2, we start to see some effects. But especially when caught early, and so a lot of pediatricians are now starting to do ACE screenings as part of the general well child check. There's a whole kind of way of approaching this called trauma-informed care. And what the first step is simply acknowledging the effect that trauma has had on that child or that adult. And from that flows the commitment that safety has to be the highest priority. So that if you are trying to teach in a school that is patently unsafe, where nobody feels safe, that's not going to work, right? You need to find and add as much safety to their lives as possible. Another one is having some degree of choice being given. This is probably more salient for adults, but allowing so that that individual knows that they do have some things under their control, that not everything that's happening to them is out of control, is out of their control. Certainly surrounding them with supportive, consistent adults who are there and can kind of tilt the balance a little bit towards a feeling of safety. And again, I keep going back to that idea of safety, right? And safety can be as simple as, you come in the classroom and you don't have your math homework and your teacher realizes, and your teacher asks you, hey, what's going on? Your math homework wasn't in today. That child, even though, kids say they don't want that, in reality, I'll never forget, I was at a supermarket and there was a little one and there was some candies right down by their level. And she grabbed a whole bunch and kind of looked at her mom with glee that she was being naughty. And the mom didn't see, she didn't happen to notice. And the child's face absolutely fell because she was trying to do a volley, right? A serve and response. And she got not the response that she was expecting. So, I mean, I think there are all kinds of ways that are not medical. Certainly, if they have depression, if they have anxiety, then that warrants a referral to a counselor, possibly need medication. But there's so many things that can create a sense of safety and security and predictability that will help mitigate some of the trauma that they've had earlier in their lives.
Great response, Dr. Lincoln. Thank you for the question, Ms. Clark. If there are any other questions or comments, please unmute yourself and chime in.
Is there anything in any of the schools where there's like a peer-based arrangement for help where kids who aren't struggling but are interested in helping those that have a forum for that? Or is that a kind of a touchy area to start? You don't want to make kids counselors to other kids, but I would think that, in some regards, a peer-to-peer interaction might actually be more helpful than one with a teacher. I don't know how you monitor that if you set that up, but is there anything like that happens in Yes Prep or anywhere out there?
Yeah, I'd like to fill that one. I had the opportunity to attend a Texas School Social Workers Conference that they have every year. And at that conference, that very same subject and idea was presented. And I took that idea back to my campus. And as a student support counselor, I was able to roll out what we call the Be a Buddy, Not a Bully program. And it matched, and I'm also fortunate enough to be at a school where there's middle school and high school. It matched high school students with middle school students. And to your point, it is something that I had to make sure through evidence-based practice, also had to make sure that I was there and present for much of the conversation and laid out some training and protocol for the older buddies to be aware of and to follow. Certainly anytime something like suicide comes up, you want to refer them directly to me. But I'm not sure if it's something standard across the board at all Yes Prep schools. Student support counselors like myself, we get the liberty to work with our dean of students and the director of student support services to say, hey, what are the most salient topics on our campus and what interventions do we want to put in place to kind of tackle those things? And so the Be a Buddy, Not a Bully program is something that I've done at my campus. Other campuses might say, hey, we have different issues we need to tackle. But I do think, to your point, Mr. Colonna, it's very important. And you get to see the growth, and it's binary. You see the growth in the person that's the elder peer, you see the growth in the person that's the younger peer. And by the time the younger peer gets to become an elder, they'll remember that same program. And I have several of those same students now that are high school students. They're coming back and wanting to give back and wanting to be a peer to somebody else as well. So very good program. I'm not sure it's streamlined across the board, but I do know that social workers like myself at particular campuses can roll it out. The floor is still open for other questions or thoughts or comments.
So this is maybe a little bit off the point, but it's certainly been in the news a lot lately. All the kerfuffle around textbooks and the concerns that math books should just have arithmetic in them. But that, there is also a school of thought that incorporating social emotional learning in all the subjects that are included is important and valuable, as opposed to those people who say that's a waste of kids' time and they just need to know how to multiply and divide. I'd just be curious to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I can answer too. I think to learn well, you have to be well. You have to be well. Like, you have to have an emotional and a social, well-being before you can even study or think about learning in the classroom. So I think just focusing on just the classroom is not going to help kids succeed very well.
Shannon, I'll jump in quickly and respond to this. Just to slightly reshape the way we think about this. Math is an easy one to point out because there's this misconception. I used to be a math teacher that it exists in a vacuum, that it's not connected at all to reality. But math taught best connects to reality. It connects to personal experience. And in textbooks, there is a social emotional connection. The default connection, though, is upper middle class white. I mean, that's the truth. And so when you're reading and learning math, you are socially, emotionally connecting to it if you are the predominant culture that's reading the way that it's written. And so what we're arguing is, let's take math, let's take our curriculum and write it in a way that our students can connect to it. It doesn't change the content of it. It just allows students to access it in a way that their white peers, their more affluent peers, might be able to sort of naturally, because of the way things tend to get written in our country. Just a way to reframe the thinking on it.
Yeah, I this was a long time ago. I was doing a little tutoring, and I was appalled that the geometry question, and this was for low-income kids, the geometry question was about your family's going on a ski trip and talking about, how the altitude at the base of the mountain and the altitude at the top of the chairlift, and have to calculate. So which is just an egregious example, but yeah, I mean, I expected that to be the answer because it just makes sense. Thanks. Thank you.
Yes, we do have a hand up. Yep.
Yeah, I had a question. May I? You hear me? Okay. So you may have read, there was a recent, I guess, series by the Houston Chronicle on lack of mental health professionals in schools, and that it really didn't single anybody out. It basically said that all public schools, in very few public schools in Texas, and Houston was no exception, had the requisite number of mental health professionals on staff. And I know that, you can pick apart the statistic and say certain categories of FTEs weren't necessarily counted right. But I guess in the speaker's opinions, if we could put, if we could add more mental health professionals into the schools, what kinds of specialists would you most feel that we needed in both high schools and then in our elementary schools?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and respond to that. I would say certainly more access to school therapists. We are one of few campuses in the Yes Prep district that has legacy school-based on our campus. And I was actually here before there was that partnership on our campus. I remember how challenging it was to get families access to therapeutic supports. We're talking about parents that had to take off work to pick up a child, to transport them across town, to get into a therapy appointment, versus now that legacy is actually on our campus. And we're fortunate to have 2 therapists. It's a great push in the right direction, but I also see firsthand that we actually still need more. There's a waiting list, and there's been a waiting list almost like the second week of school. So if you can imagine,
a therapist waiting list. Okay.
Waiting list,
wow.
Yeah, for both therapists. I mean, they're full. And the minute they reach goals with certain clients and the client transitions out, there's another student that's then placed on that waiting list. So it's a huge need in terms of how many students we can get access to that particular part of an intervention, having a therapist through our partnership with Legacy. And I know there may be room for growth, maybe other campuses that don't even have legacy partnerships on their school grounds. That might be something that might be worthwhile. I know certainly for us, like again, going back to the years before Legacy was on our campus, I remember how difficult it was to try to get placement for everybody across the board. So I can only imagine what the other schools are doing that don't have a legacy partnership on their campus, because even with that partnership, I still see the need for more. If we can get a 3rd therapist or a 4th therapist on our school grounds, it would do us a lot better. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree. A lot of our KIPP schools, which we started that partnership a few years before the Yes Prep, do have 2 therapists on campus because they're full. We also started psychiatry a couple of years ago for students at Yes Prep. That wait list is at 69 patients right now. So child adolescent psychiatrists would be amazing. And then also psychological testing. I recently referred a patient and it took them a year to get that testing done. And it turned out they did have autism and they were in 3rd grade. You know, no one had identified that. So psychological testing, it's so backed up.
So you need the therapist for obvious reasons for anyone who needs help, and then the psychiatrist who could maybe help prescribe medication.
Yeah, for some kids, they need a little bit of higher level of care, and the psychiatrist is really helpful. And Legacy, we always had advantage of having 32 psychiatrists on staff, which no one else has, where we could refer them, but we're working on making it more collaborative care. So if they do get stabilized by the psychiatrist, they can move back into primary care for their ADHD refills and things like that. So that's something on the horizon. And then we could, so stabilizing them and working closely with the psychiatrist.
Yeah, and the testing that rings. So, I mean, I'm going through some of this, in my own family, and it's expensive for me. Let's, so it's prohibitive for most everybody, and just knowing where to go, knowing how to access it, waiting for that assessment, putting it off because nobody else is giving it. I'm curious whether, like, Robin may know, or Jennifer, whether we have any specific giving opportunities set aside for mental health, because when you relay that to people, like just like the waiting list on our lottery, and because our donors who are well off are doing this for their kids, let me just tell you. And then, if they hear, of this need and a specific set of numbers on what we can't fulfill, I think that would be very compelling.
I can get someone a list of the current wait lists at each campus. Jennifer, I can send that to you by the end of the week, probably.
Great. Yes, Robin just popped this in the chat. We do have a family relief fund, and this would be the place where we support directly our students and families. So I can send that information in our post follow-up email if that's something that you'd like to support. There's always a need, for sure. Okay, just looking at time, but it looks like Brian, you've got a question?
Yeah, one question, just listening to how the resources are stretched so thin, and of course the cost of adding an additional counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist into the staff. I'm wondering if there's certainly a face-to-face meeting is probably the best, but I wonder if there's some application that's kind of like a doc in a box thing, where it helps the it helps the counselor to be able to spread themselves wider across campuses, do more meetings, be more efficient, and then in instances where it's clear that a face-to-face is necessary, maybe to prioritize that one, and maybe do more with less staffing. And in fact, I guess I could picture some ways, to make the kind of the light of something that I told my kids when they were young. You can't break up with somebody, on social media or by a text. You owe them a face-to-face conversation. Flip it on its head. I think some kids who are struggling with something might be more inclined, almost like these anonymous tip line kind of things, where you turn somebody in for bad behavior at your office or something like that, where a kid might be more comfortable to have that kind of counseling conversation, maybe initially only, with somebody online. That barrier, which makes it almost like a virtual conversation, might allow them to be more open and honest, while at the same time allowing the staff to see more kids in a week, see more kids in a week.
Yeah, great question. I'll field it, and I'll turn it over to Mark, who's got some closing comments coming up soon. But great question. I'm glad to say that we use an electronic referral system called Purple, and all of the student support counselors are tasked with checking each electronic referral and responding to it and prioritizing it within 24 to 48 hours. That's something that can be accessed by our students, by our families, and anybody in the school community, and sometimes anonymously. And so when I'm looking at my referrals, I can prioritize, okay, this one needs an immediate face-to-face. This one maybe I can do in a group face-to-face, and this one I can address maybe later on down the line. So it's a great tool, it's a great resource, and it's also impactful because it helps us keep track of all the interventions and check-ins that we've done over a period of time. So my interventions with the 6th grader now can be seen 6 years later when they're in 12th grade by the support counselor that they're working with at that time. Great question, thank you. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you again, Naeem, Dr. Link, and Jessica for your time. Really appreciate the thoughts that you shared. As I always do, I just want to close this with a couple quick charges. The first is make sure that you have your calendars marked. I want to say it is May 25th. Is that right? 25th for senior signing day. We are back in person at the Toyota Center, and we will be sending you, have we already sent it, or we're going to be sending an invite to a community reception?
Will be
Coming.
Invite coming, but mark your calendars for senior signing day, the morning of May 25th at Toyota Center. I am pumped. We had it kind of in person last year, although it was outside at Rice and it poured rain. So this will be weatherproof in the Toyota Center. Next quick call to action before I share a personal thought is that Jennifer's going to be sending a link to a survey to complete that will basically help us expand our connections to foundation trustees. The idea is that the more we can get the word out, the more we can garner support for all the work that you heard about today at Yes Prep. So it shouldn't take you more than a few minutes to fill out. Thank you in advance for taking the time to fill that out, and you'll get that soon. And then finally, I put in the chat, if you'd like to open it, I put a picture of my son because the closing charge is going to be related to my son, Gavin. I've shared this with our board, so I wanted to share it with the advisory council too. About probably a year and a half ago now, my son had what I think is best described as a complete mental breakdown, mental health crisis. He has been pretty much stable his whole life. And then all of a sudden, his grades started plummeting. He was having suicidal thoughts, just crying randomly, just all of the things that I've heard of sort of out there hit home in our house right in the middle of COVID. And we got him the supports that he needed. And I'm just thrilled to say that he's in a much better place after having gotten diagnosed. Gone through the whole testing procedure, meeting with a therapist, but all of this stuff went from being something that I thought about sort of at the intellectual level out there to something that hit home as a father in my family. And for the longest time, I wrestled with, don't we have a stable family? Like, how is this happening in our family? And it wasn't until I actually started talking to a therapist where you realize that many times these things are completely disconnected in terms of situation and just a chemical issue that's going on in a brain. When you compile that with the type of trauma that our guest speakers were talking about, the number of our kids face, you've got chemical issues going on, and you have situational based trauma going on. You compile those, it creates nothing short of a crisis in the families that we serve. But it's not just in the families that we serve, it's in your families, it's in your neighborhoods. And so my charge is look, see, reach out. There is someone in your close vicinity, I promise you, who is hurting. And if you take the time to look and you take the time to see, then you can take the time to help and to share some of what we talked about today. So I encourage you to do so. Thank you again for your time today. Deeply appreciate the commitment of the Advisory Council. Already looking forward to our next chance to connect, hopefully at our in-person senior signing day at Toyota Center on May 25th. That's all we got. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
I know.
Thank you.